camera mounted on the rover. Adding new equipment to their already overweight vehicle was not something the engineers needed.
It was a very difficult, stressful time. We worked late hours. We worked probably 16, 17 hours a day, and mostly Saturdays and sometimes Sundays.
A certain part of the schedule, unless we did something different.
17 months of intense development.
We were elated that the system was ready for the deadline. And so it was a big occasion. We were extremely happy that we made it just by a day or two ahead of schedule. It was a great occasion to deliver
monitoring their rover. There was nothing left to do but cross their fingers for lunar exploration, which had inspired Wernher von Braun and all the Apollo engineers.
And the next step of the deployment, successful.
That looks good.
In spaceflight. And now 2 astronauts were driving on another world.
Man, this is really a rock and rollin' ride, isn't it? Never been on a ride like this before. Oh boy. I'm glad they got this great suspension system on this thing. Boy. Man must explore. And this is exploration at its greatest.
For the first time, Apollo astronauts were to travel miles from their lunar module. And for that, they needed the rover.
Step of the deployment, successful.
That looks good.
Far so good, but as Dave Scott and Jim Irwin began to check the rover's systems, they made a discovery that dismayed everyone at Mission Control.
I don't get much out of turning the front wheels.
Go 17 months down the drain.
Okay, it's a good idea. Hey, Jim, I'm going to bring her around here and let's get on with it, okay?
Now, at last, for the rover engineers came the moment of truth. After everything it had been through, would the rover start?
We were sitting on needles to see what's going to happen.
Okay, Jim, here we go. Okay, Dave, we want a heading of 203. Okay, we're moving forward, Joe.
Roger.
Ooh, hang on. I'm glad they got this great suspension system on this thing. Boy.
The hard workmanship of the Boeing people, the General Motors people, and the Marshall Space Flight Center people that supported the program.
Well, this is really a sporty driving course. Man, oh man, what a Grand Prix this is.
It was the farthest any astronaut had ventured from the relative safety of the lunar module. But Mission Control was able to keep an eye on them thanks to the new improved TV camera mounted on the front of the rover.
We came up with vehicle concepts of the wheel type, track-laying vehicles like tanks. We even looked at an Archimedean screw in case everything's submerged under the surface. It can burrow itself through the loose material.
While Ferentz's wheel designs were still being put through their paces, the ever-visionary von Braun was already planning the exploration missions that a lunar rover might undertake. He wondered if astronauts could really survive for 2 weeks inside such a small mobile laboratory.
NASA was looking for volunteers, and I raised my hand. I was one of the 2 test subjects on that test. I was selected and made the commander. They kept us in there for a total of 18 days. We were good friends at the beginning of the test, but we weren't too friendly toward the end. We were getting on each other's nerves, to say the least. And we were very surprised when the lights came on and they said the test is over, you can come out now. And as we walked out of MOLAB, there in front of us was not only our wives waiting for us, but Dr. Werner von Braun.
It was going to be quite a feat of origami to get it in.
Into his office. Now, he was at the telephone at the time. I looked at his face and I saw just a great surprise. So we spent as much as a half hour with him in discussing the concept, and he became very enthusiastic.
Once more, NASA invited tenders for the contract to build a new lightweight lunar rover.
Did not permit dust and dirt and stones to anyway contaminate the operation of the wheel. Don't just go to the lunar surface, use it for a few days. Be able to hit a switch and turn it on and let Houston continue to run it out there. I mean, go down some craters you wouldn't have the guts to go down if it was manned.
Had 17 months to be ready for the Apollo 15 flight.
Already had a working miniature of their rover design, but now Boeing had to build it for real. And their toughest task was to make it light enough.
As the rover.
The rover had both front and rear steering. Both would steer, they would steer at the same time. Or they could be disabled, the front or the back could be disabled. We did that for redundancy.
Sixth gravity.
To achieve the 1/6 gravity as best you could here on Earth, you counterweighted this rover with cables. It seemed to just float across rocks, and it's sort of a giddy feeling. I thought, well, you should have felt a heavy shock. It didn't. It just sort of...
Over 17 miles across the plains of Hadley on the most extraordinary geological field trip of all time.
Can you imagine that, Joe? Here sits this rock, and it's been here since before creatures roamed the sea on our little Earth. There it is. And there it is, Houston. There's Camelot. Wow, target. I see it.
2 more rovers were flown to the moon on board the last Apollo missions, 16 and 17. In April 1972, the second rover transported explorers Charlie Duke and John Young across the Descartes Highlands.
That's 20 pounds of rocks. Oh, Tony, it's got some beautiful crystals in it, though.
They brought back 200 pounds of rock samples, which revolutionized our understanding of the moon's geology. And in December 1972, the third rover took Gene Cernan and geologist Jack Schmidt deep into the volcanic Taurus Littrow Valley.
Orange soil. It's all over. Orange.
Together, the 3 vehicles carried their crews safely across more than 56 miles of rugged lunar terrain. On the rover, as the astronauts climbed the mountains of the moon and traversed its plains, the rest of the world was able to explore along with them. Thing he'd been unsuccessfully trying to capture since Apollo 15, a lunar liftoff. The 6-second delay between pressing the buttons at Mission Control and seeing the results on his screen made this a difficult task.
On Apollo 15, we had some motor problems with the camera system.
What a ride, what a ride.
On Apollo 16, the lunar module flew out of the picture. On Apollo 17, what I was watching to get those pictures was a sheet of paper. And on that sheet of paper was time versus command. Started to move, the camera was already in operation.
3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good.
Apollo 17's liftoff ended mankind's exploration of the moon. But the machines that took us there had done more than transport a couple of dozen Americans to the lunar surface. They had expanded the horizon of humanity. We were no longer an earthbound species. It was a profound step in the evolution of the human race. But for the 400,000 men and women involved in the Apollo program, it was simply the highlight of their lives.
Well, occasionally when I look at the moon, I can see 3 places where the rovers exist. I know they're there, and I feel good about them being there. And I'm sure that all the folks that worked on the rover and worked on the Apollo program feel the same way. It was quite an experience.
I feel like I was so fortunate to have been born when I was born and to have had the opportunities that I had to participate in mankind's greatest adventure. And it's with deep humility that I look back at those days and realize what an accomplishment it really was.
I believe that this nation should commit itself.
1961. And as the implications of Kennedy's speech sank in, many of the country's top aerospace engineers wondered whether it was really possible to get to the moon.
We're not ready enough with our rockets and so on to spend any time on it.
But NASA was in a hurry, and 2 months after Kennedy's announcement, the first Apollo contract was awarded.
At all of the prime contracts to build the rockets, to build the spacecraft, to build the capsules, to build the lunar lander, none of those contracts would even be let for months, in some cases years, to the moon.
The contract went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and ran into immediate controversy.
Ordinarily, what the government contracts out to build hardware for operational systems. Here was a university essentially committing to build a system that was going to fly to the moon.
But MIT was no ordinary university. The lab was run by a colorful and charismatic engineer called Charles Draper.
Types of technologies.
Bob Siemens was one of Draper's early students.
He said, you're not going to have money for the babes, you're not going to have money for the horses, but you'll have an awful lot of fun.
Like a basketball. It's about that size. And inside of it are these very, very precise gyroscopes. And all the gyroscopes do is actually keep the platform perfectly flat and aligned in what's called inertial space. That means not space relative to the Earth or to the Earth horizon, but out.
So it provides a known baseline or platform.
If this computer failed, if one of the circuits went bad, or
to a standstill. For a while, it looked as though the technology would never.
Laboratory.
Lanning remembers wrestling with the difficulty of computer overload.
There were no specs. We made it up. That's the way it was. We made it up as we went along. Our output, that was maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. If you screwed up, you got an output that was maybe 2 feet thick.
The solution today seems extraordinary. It was called rope memory.
And if the wire goes through the core, it represents a 1, and around the core, it represents a 0.
Bill Tyndall starts looking at the Apollo software and ringing alarm bells. In fact, he writes back to headquarters and says, I worry that we might not make the end of the decade deadline for the moon landing because the programs won't be finished. Very strong statement when you're building these enormous rockets and you're building launch pads and you're training astronauts, and then a bunch of programs might keep you from getting to the moon on the president's deadline. Very, very unusual situation.
Started knocking heads together.
Bill Tyndall came to the laboratory on Friday the 13th. We called it the LOL method, the little old lady method. of wiring these cores.
In October 1968, Apollo 7 became the first successful manned Apollo mission. For 11 days, 3 astronauts orbited the Earth, using the sextant to check the automatic guidance system.
This mission is coming to you approximately halfway between the moon and the Earth. We have about less than 40 hours left to go to the moon.
As the astronauts headed towards the moon, they checked their position over and over again.
Jim Lovell decided that he would show that you could do navigation on board the spacecraft using the sextant, and he did that many times actually, and demonstrated it worked extremely well.
Then, as Apollo 8 disappeared behind the moon, all communication with Earth vanished.
16.5 by 16.5. Apollo 8, this is Houston. Roger. Good to hear your voice.
Apollo 8 had reemerged, right on schedule, and was back in radio contact. Seconds later, MIT's computer relayed back its on-board calculation of where the spacecraft was. For the engineers, it was the vindication of years of hard work and broken marriages.
I remember watching it at home, Christmas Eve, 1968. So I was like, a million other people that watched the same flight. Brought tears to the eyes. That it's doing it to me now. Even just sitting at home, watching it on a little TV, black and white. It was we did that. Staggering thought.
But now the computer that had helped them around the moon would have to do something even more demanding. July 21st, 1969, and Apollo 11 was 3 days into its mission to land on the moon.
Apollo 11, Houston, we are go for undocking, over.
As the lunar modules separated from the command module, Armstrong and Aldrin were 12 minutes from the lunar surface.
I think you got a fine-looking flying machine there, Eagle, despite the fact you're upside down. Somebody's upside down.
They were about to draw on an entirely new software routine never fully tested in space before. The program without which it would be impossible to land on the moon. Yet, incredibly, the program had been written almost as an afterthought by a junior engineer.
If you talk to the guy who really wrote a lot of that software, Don Iles, here's this 22-year-old guy, gets his first job. The program is already 2/3 of the way complete, and they assign him to write the programs to do the actual lunar landing.
There was always a trade-off of time versus memory. You could always write something quicker if you could use more space to do it.
It wasn't just brand new. It was one of the most complicated routines MIT had ever written.
Neil Armstrong said, in terms of a scale of 1 to 10 of difficulty, walking around on the moon was about a 3. Landing on the moon was a 13.
On top of our consoles. It's like an umbrella. If you carry it, it won't rain.
We had a nickname for Jack. He won't forgive me for saying this, but we call him Garflash.
Return radar too early, and the computer had simply been unable to handle that as well as all the immediate landing data. It was a checklist error. The computer had worked exactly as it had been designed to.
9, 8.
They were safe to return, and after nearly 22 hours on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin were given the go-ahead to return home.
Very smooth.
2.5 days later, with the support of the computer guidance system, the command module crashed through the Earth's atmosphere at precisely the right angle. The relief at MIT was overwhelming. 60s, as NASA began training astronauts to meet President Kennedy's challenge, it realized there was one key area of expertise it knew nothing about: how to build a spacesuit that would enable a human being to survive in the lethal lunar environment.
There was enough cartoons and little movie clips and
the lunar module, all these pieces of hard goods. They knew how to bolt metal together. They could do drawings. They understood that. But when it came to a spacesuit, you're talking fabrics. And when you try taking it from the world that knows hard goods, it became a real problem.
A young science graduate remembers being called by a puzzled NASA engineer.
Spacesuits, whatever they are. And that was his exact words, whatever they are. And he said, does that sound of interest to you? Of course, I'm looking for a job and I want to get in the space program. And I said, well, you know, my background is in propulsion and structures. I don't know much about spacesuits.
But learn from what? In the early years of what became known as the Apollo program, there was very little experience to draw on. Post commissioned a flying suit for an attempt on the world altitude record.
They had taken a diving helmet from a diving suit, and because Wiley Post was blind in one eye, they had physically moved the optical viewport off to one side to make it easier for him to get the best possible visibility.
On the Earth. But in all these craft, the cockpit provided the first line of safety. The flying suits were only there in case there was an accident. Kennedy's plan to have men leave this safety and step out onto the moon would demand something much more sophisticated. To illustrate the challenge, NASA introduced the U.S. public to a new cartoon figure, Andy Astronaut.
If Andy were to step out on the surface of the moon without a spacesuit, this is what would happen. In the near vacuum of space, the gases within his body would immediately expand. His blood would appear to boil from the rapid expansion of gases coming out of solution in his bloodstream. Andy would soon feel the effects of another condition of space, lack of oxygen. After 20 seconds in a vacuum and without oxygen, Andy would be trading in his astronaut wings for a more permanent variety.
For aircraft and also for the Department of Defense. International Latex at that time made brassieres. We had two totally different personalities.
We slowly, stitch by stitch, to make these suits, to put them together.
One of the hazards was sewing pins. Hamilton, in its capacity as environmental control experts, was also responsible for what was delicately referred to as waste management. Don Rethke became known as Dr. Flush for his ingenuity in dealing with the issue.
Pouch, okay? Don't get the two confused, because the wrong pouch will not work in the right place. So inside the urine collection assembly, which we kind of affectionately call the pee pouch, was about a 1 liter bag in this area down here. And the attachment to the body was done by a condom with a hose on the end of it, which you can urinate right into the bag.
The condoms initially came in 3 different sizes: small, medium, and large. But few astronauts, whatever their real dimensions, were willing to accept they were anything but large. So NASA changed the categories.
We changed the name to large, gigantic, and humongous. So large still worked.
Gradually, piece by piece, the life support system came together. Record time. He was shown designs of a British garment which used water-filled plastic tubes. Jennings set up an experiment to see how well it worked. Harlan Brosey was his test subject.
We wrapped his arms and legs in PVC tubing.
We then put a sweatsuit across my body. Then, in addition, to make sure that we didn't evaporate anything off of the sweatsuit, we put a plastic suit over me, plastic boots, plastic gloves, plastic all over, so that no water could possibly get away from the body. Including my head, I believe, was covered with a plastic bonnet.
The idea was to ensure that none of Brosey's body heat could escape. Then the PVC tubes were hooked up to a bucket of iced water.
The cool water flowed into the connector and through the tubing to be circulated around the user's body.
There were hundreds of feet of fine tubing running over the entire body. Hamilton's system would become the standard method of keeping astronauts cool in space.
That was very good. That was very good.
That no one could tamper with it, steal it, or whatever it was, because it was classified confidential. Okay? They were tough to move around in, they were tough to wear, they were heavy, and so the customer wasn't very happy about them. They expected to see much more progress.
One of the tests was in an aircraft that was used to simulate lunar gravity. You had to be able to fall on your back like a turtle and then successfully get back up without any assistance. Unfortunately, the new design spacesuit wasn't able to do that.
There are laws of physics that say you can't do certain things.
Work paid off. ILC, free at last to follow its instincts as a clothing manufacturer, came up with a new, flexible, and close-fitting suit that was better than any of the competition.
We ended up winning the competition because our suit had great flexibility. It was built the way we wanted to build it. It had great narrow shoulders. You can look at the pictures and see how tapered this suit was compared to the other two suits.
Cooled layer. An extraordinarily clever pressurized inner suit with flexible joints. And a white outer garment, finished in a toughened nylon fabric that provided protection from the extremes of temperature in space. Took shape. As the suits rolled off the production line, they were exhaustively tested. The company's guinea pig was Tom Sylvester.
I ran, I kicked and punted and passed and did a rolling block like they do in football.
From the rigid bladder of just 5 years before,
would take the suit and suspend it in this crazy contraption where they suspended the astronauts or test subjects in the suit, and they would walk along this wall with this rig.
Dave Jennings tried it out.
I had free use of my legs, both legs, independently. I could jump and bounce around, and just like the pictures of the actual astronauts on the actual moon. Exactly. I did the same thing, big leaps and bounds. I found out that I could do somersaults, and I found out I could do backward somersaults, which is something that I always wanted to be able to do. These backward somersaults were so much fun that I did a dozen of them. And here were all these engineers standing around watching me, with their mouths open, I suppose.
But the ultimate and most dangerous test was a huge, specially constructed vacuum chamber. The tube pressurizing his suit had become disconnected. He was in serious danger.
There really wasn't any feeling. It was just happening so fast, trying to get the chamber back to a safe pressure and Jim to a safe pressure. He was inside the suit.
As I stumbled backwards, I could feel the saliva on my tongue starting to bubble.
I was ever exposed to that low of a pressure and lived to tell about it with no obvious damage.
Such an accident in space would have been fatal. The suits were holding up to everything that could be thrown at them, and the program was back on schedule. On January 27, 1967, the Apollo 1 command module caught fire during a practice countdown.
I got a call from one of my people in Houston, and he goes, "You probably didn't hear, but they had a catastrophic fire at the Kennedy Center."
All 3 crew members died in the intense heat of the blaze.
The program started to just churn. Churn and churn and churn.
It had gotten into.
The company scoured the country, talking to manufacturers working at the cutting edge of fabric technology. Apollo missions 7, 8, 9, and 10 took men into space without a hitch. Then came July 1969, and the biggest test of all.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm going to step off the limb now.
As the Apollo 11 astronauts stepped out on the moon, the world celebrated.
Smile on my face, but in my stomach were all these butterflies, and gulp a little bit. The astronauts were obviously euphorically enjoying what they were doing and seemed to be ad-libbing a little bit of activity as they were going on. And every time this ad-libbing would come up, I could think of nothing but, please go back up that ladder and get back into the safety of that lunar module. All I could think of was the world is looking at ILC right now, and we need to get this over with.
And work on the moon without a single significant failure.
It's a football-sized rock. It's a great Scott size.
It was the culmination of a long time. And it was very, very satisfying. It's the best thing we've ever done.
But this two-legged thing is great. Man, I can cover ground like a kangaroo. How'd you like that? Beautiful maneuver there, Charlie.
To the moon, 240,000 miles away, a giant rocket, more than 300 feet tall.
I mean, it just was unbelievable.
Water.
The food supply. To get a feel for the layout of the new 3-man spacecraft.
Getting 3 people to live in that little house for
a spacecraft large enough to sustain 3 men all the way to the moon would be too big to safely return to Earth.
It's the fuel cells for the power. It has the oxygen and hydrogen tanks that are the reactants for the fuel cells, and it's got, of course, the engine.
With much of the weight of the spacecraft in the service module, the Apollo capsule would now be small and light enough to survive re-entry. But there wouldn't be much space for the three-man crew to live for 10 days.
If you look at it very simply, it's about a 6 by 6 by 6 cube. That's what you're living in.
It didn't matter at the time. But the consequences of this simple fact would bring America's race to the moon to a shocking halt. Hydrogen and oxygen gases which powered the spacecraft's rocket engine. In the rocket, the gases reacted together, creating heat and pressure to push the spacecraft forward.
Produced actually worked.
This time, they had made a little mistake in how they hooked up the roll gyros. And the vehicle started to roll. When it broke the link on the escape rocket. The escape rocket fired, pulled the command module right off the top. And it was a perfectly successful flight, very well instrumented flight, gave us all the data we needed about the launch escape system, but the vehicle had failed in the process.
Ironically, the unanticipated failure of the Little Joe rocket provided the best possible test for the escape system. He and America's first spacewalker, Ed White, were not happy either, openly mocking the command module's reliability during a pre-mission photo shoot. At 1 p.m. on January 27, 1967, all that was left was re-entry.
Okay, it's been real fine, Walt. Just a final update on the weather and the recovery area. 2,000 broken, winds 270 at 20, wave height is 3 feet.
For any capsule re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, three things mattered more than anything else.
Parachutes, parachutes, parachutes. There's
For the engineering teams at Mission Control,